What's up guys, my name is Laura and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, we are going to talk about tons of photography and social media marketing tips. And today specifically, we are going to be talking about the exposure triangle or the exposure triad. So what exactly does that mean? The exposure triangle refers to the three settings that you'll need to understand and master in order to light your photos beautifully in manual mode. So I know manual mode is like a dreaded mode for a lot of people that don't know that much about photography. It definitely is intimidating, but if you get out there and practice and you just understand the basic tenets, you're gonna be a great photographer in no time. If you haven't already, please go ahead and like this video, subscribe to my channel. Let's get into it. Okay, so the exposure triangle. What are the three elements that we need to understand in the exposure triangle? We have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's talk about aperture first. So this is basically what your standard lens looks like, right? So this hole right in here is where the light comes in. So the hole or the shutter opens up, and then there's a sensor behind it that basically etches the image, so to speak. It basically, if you think back to the days before digital photography was invented to the film days, there was a piece of light sensitive photo paper in the back, and that's what was getting exposed. Now it's actually a digital sensor, so it's a little bit different, but the same rules still apply. So we have our aperture. So the aperture is how wide our shutter opens. So if that shutter opens really wide, it's gonna let a lot more light in than if it only opens up this wide, right? So the wider our aperture, the brighter our image will be. Now, this is a little bit confusing. So when you're trying to remember it, just remember that it's the opposite of what is intuitive. Wider apertures, bigger apertures have lower numbers. So an example of a low aperture would be 2.8. And an example of a high aperture would be f16. Now, aperture is also called f-stop. You've probably heard the term f-stop before. Most people, I think, use the term aperture, but photographers will say things like stopping down on your image. If they say stopping down, they actually mean you're going up in numbers. So if you're stopping down, they're saying make your aperture smaller to let in less light. So that's a little bit of photography lingo 101 for you. So the next thing you have to understand in the exposure triangle is shutter speed. So again, we have this shutter, right? And shutter speed is simply the speed at which the shutter opens. Pretty easy to understand and remember, right? So a quick shutter speed is, a typical standard shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So I can't even probably move my hand that fast, but it's just 1/60th of a second. I definitely can't move my hand that fast. Actually, if you think about it, it's one fraction of a second. Whereas a longer shutter speed, let's say 1 full second, that's considered a long shutter speed, would be like, so that's what you're doing when you're doing long exposure photography at night, things like that. So the quicker the shutter opens and closes, the less light is going to get in and the less motion blur that you're going to have. So anything that's moving in the picture, it'll be relatively sharp. If you're shooting like sports photography or something like that, you might want to go a bit higher than 1/60th of a second. 1/60th is like your standard for like portraits and like non-moving things. If you're like taking pictures of a race car or something, you're obviously going to want to go way higher, like 1/250th of a second or something like that. So and then if you're leaving your shutter open for longer periods of time, like I said, that's often used in night photography, long exposure photography, as we call it. If you've ever seen photos of a waterfall or a river where the water is like almost blurry and it looks like it's moving, that is the technique that they are using to achieve that effect. So the one downside of a longer shutter speed is that you will get more motion blur for things that are moving. So if you put your shutter at like 1 second and you tried to take a picture of a person who wasn't even moving a lot, maybe they were just like kind of staying there, but like little micro movements, that photo is not going to be sharp. It's going to be blurry. So if we use longer shutter speeds, it's imperative that we use a tripod. Okay, so the third thing in the exposure triangle that you have to understand for amazing photos in manual mode is ISO. ISO is how sensitive your sensor in your camera is to light. So basically, if we had a low ISO, it's not going to be very sensitive to light. And if we have a high ISO, it's going to be very sensitive to light. Now, a lot of people would think, okay, well, we should just use a high ISO then, because I want my picture to be bright and, you know, well lit and yada, yada, yada. Not necessarily. So if you go high on your ISO, you will get what we call grain. So basically when you zoom in on the image, you'll see this like noise. It's almost like a static TV. And we don't want that. We want our image to be sharp and grain free. So with ISO, the general rule of thumb is to keep it as low as possible, but still achieving the brightness that you want in your image. So you're gonna wanna set your ISO pretty low, play around with your shutter speed and your aperture. And if you don't have any more space to move on your shutter speed or aperture, like for example, let's say your aperture is already open as wide as it can possibly go, and your shutter speed is at a 60th of a second, and you can't open your shutter speed anymore because you don't have a tripod on you and you're taking a picture of a person, so you don't want any motion blur to come into the photo, then you could increase your ISO. It's not a huge deal to increase your ISO a bit, but like I said, if you have the option, definitely leave it as low as you possibly can. So that's pretty much it. That is what makes up the exposure triangle. So my best tip from here would be to get out there and just shoot and practice. That is the easiest way to learn photography. You know, when you sit here and talk about it in theory, sometimes you overcomplicate it, right? So just getting out there and just practicing is going to help you immensely. Between every shot, look at the photo and think about what went wrong. Was it too bright? Was it too dark? Is there motion blur in the photo, you know? And just tweak things over time and you'll start to better understand. If you're really, really intimidated, you could always start by leaving it on automatic for the first couple shots and seeing what the camera gives you, you know? Automatic mode, it's always going to be at least a mediocre or better result. The reason that we do need to understand shooting on manual mode is because all of those cool effects that we talked about, like, you know, shooting a race car or doing a panning shot or doing a long exposure of a waterfall or a river with that cool soft water effect, all of those things we need to understand manual mode to achieve. So when you really start getting into photography and getting into all the cool creative things you can do with it, you do need to understand how to expose your image properly and how the interplay of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO will affect your final photo. So I hope that was helpful. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.